Okay, we're going to be talking about whiskey, specifically our allocated Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. We've got the flights now up at top of the world. It's 150 for 4 half-ounce pours. There's 5 bottles in the collection, so we have to kind of suss out what the guests might or might not want. So let's go ahead and talk about everything. First off, we're going to talk about how to taste whiskey and how to, actually let the guest enjoy everything. So, first off, the glass that we have is the Glencairn glass. Now, with this one, this is the tasting glass that distillers use in the distillery. The reason why is there's actually a area of the nose that actually fits right in there, allowing you to get deep into there and get all those different notes. Now, the problem with whiskey is when you pour it fresh into a glass, there's going to be ethanol and alcohol, and that's what chokes people up. So, for the guest benefit, I'm going to teach y'all how to taste properly. So you can teach them so that you're not going to kill your guests, especially when we get up to here. These George T. Stagg and Thomas H. Handy, these are above 130 proof. So these are definitely going to hurt some guests. This is why we have to suss out their proof levels. So first off, the way that you'll taste it is you're going to swish it around your palate with a full breath of air in, which means you'll breathe in before swallowing. You're going to swallow after you breathed in, so you breathe out the ethanol and alcohol. What that's going to give the guests is a pleasant experience for the breathing. Some people call it a retrohale if you go through your nose for this. So that's going to give more notes. Now, early on, and the right side of this, or well, left side for y'all, right side for me, Sazerac 90 proof, Eagle Rare 101, William LaRue Weller, I think is 125.8. Thomas Handy is, I believe, 130. We're going to find out when we go through the notes. And then it's 138.7, I believe, for George T. Stagg, but we're going to check those proofs for certain. Um, so the proof is going to raise up. Now, for the tasting, what I did was Sazerac because it was a rye, William LaRue because it was weeded, and George T. Stagg because it was a high proof bourbon. What the guests are going to probably want to know is where their proof level is. If they traditionally don't drink high proof, I traditionally wouldn't recommend this side over here. I would pick the first 4. Now, of course, they can pick the ones that they want. This is just going to help benefit them so that the level ramps up pretty well. Because let's be honest, if you go from 90 proof, skip the Eagle Rare, go to William LaRue, that's 125 proof. You're raising up 30. You instantly right onto the palate. Otherwise, if you were to get rid of one of these N ones, you're going to have a little bit more of a pleasant experience. I would recommend, if they don't drink high proof, George T. Stagg is the one you should get rid of. But if they do drink high proof, I would recommend getting rid of the Sazerac rye, because either way, you're going to have that rye in there of the Thomas Handy. So let's talk about tasting properly. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to swish all around the palate, breathe in, breathe out, enjoy the whiskey. No bite, no burn. So breathing out immediately after gave it a pleasant experience. With this one, I'm drinking Knob Creek. It's 100 proof. This is right about here at Eagle Rare, just under. So first off, we're going to start with Sazerac, 18-year-old. We're going to open up these notes right here. So this is the 2022 release for fall. Oh, yeah, got it. So with this is Kentucky Straight Rye Whiskey. Sazerac, 18-year-old Kentucky Straight Rye Whiskey, has twice been named top 3 finest whiskeys in the world by the Whiskey Bible. We hope that you're delighted by the whiskey contained in these bottles. In distilling and aging this product, we have attempted to make some of the finest whiskeys, American whiskey, ever made. This collection of rye barrels, which was filled in the spring of 2003 and 2004, and carefully selected for this batch. So, distiller, Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, that's Kentucky. Now, they're going to be the same for all of these ones. And with this age profile, year of distillation, which we talked about earlier, spring of 2003 and 2004, it was released fall 2022. Now, when they go in about the spring, they age an extra couple of months. So it's not exactly 18 years. It's probably like 18 and 6 months or 5 months, depending on when they actually got them in. So the brand name released was Sazerac 18-year-old Kentucky Straight Rye, proofed at 90 proof. Recipe for this. Now, this is the mash bill. Large grain, which means the most dominant grain in there, is going to be Minnesota rye, because it has to have 51% of rye or more to be considered a rye. With this small grain, Kentucky Distiller Corn Grade number 1, number 2. Finishing grain is North Dakota malted barley. Barley is going to be in a lot of different whiskeys. That's what will make it technically, I think, a straight whiskey. Is malted barley. Um, with this cooking and fermentation, this just talks about their milling, the cooking temperature, the water, and how they actually do this in the fermentation. That doesn't matter as much as this word right here, the mash. They are all sour mashes. What sour mash means is they use the last bit of the mash from the bill before, they reuse that. And what happens is you get a sweeter, more robust flavor. So with this rye in particular, it has a little bit more sweeter notes. Rye gives it a little bit more of a peppery note on there. Botanical sometimes some people say black peppercorn, some people say spice like cinnamon or cardamom. You're gonna have those kind of like allspice, anise kind of brighter flavors usually in rye. So with the aging and distilling, this is double distilled, beer still, and doubler. So proof off the still, it comes off at 135 proof. They use for their barrel new white oak. It's a number 4 char, which is charred for 55 seconds. They're all the same for this. Barrel entry proof. So when it enters the barrel, after some of that proof has evaporated out and actually kind of mellowed out, it's 125 proof. Now the barrel size, there was 53 liquid gallons, which was 66.25 of the original proof gallons. The warehouses are going to be K, M, and P. The floors 2, 3, and 4. The evaporation loss, 74% of the original whiskey was lost to evaporation. Only about 25% of this recipe for this batch is what actually made it into those bottles. That is why this is so rare and allocated. They take a huge loss. That is called the angel share. What we get is what is known as the angel's envy or devil's cut, depending on what distillery you ask. For the bottle filtration, this is how they bring the proof down from that 125 proof when it enters the barrel down to 90. They use a chill filtration, which means they add chilled water, which is going to bring that proof down. The product ages 18 years and 6 months at bottling. The tasting comments, which are the notes: nose, orange peel, lemon zest, molasses, palate, a bold blend of black peppercorn, coriander seeds, and maple syrup. Finish well-rounded with mint, tobacco leaf, and oak. So those are all the notes. From knowing it's a rye, we already kind of knew pepper and all those like allspice, cardamom flavors, sweet maple syrup. It's funny how whiskey starts doing this. Now, who made Sazerac famous? The Sazerac cocktail gained fame largely due to its association with Antoine Amédée, which I think that's the name, Peychaud's. Peychaud's bitters, that's where that comes from. It was a coffee house in New Orleans. Peychaud, a Creole apothecary, is credited with creating the cocktail using his proprietary bitters in the early 1830s. Jesus, I can't even talk. So that's why. I mean, we can go into more depth. Obviously, you guys can read this right here if you want. You can pause it, zoom in. You can look it up yourself. I just used Google for this, or, my browser is Brave. So the next one we're going to talk about, Eagle Rare. Now, Eagle Rare is 101 proof. This one is 17 years old. For the 2022, we're going to talk about these notes right here. So with this one in particular, the 2022 Ultimate Spirits Challenge Award is last year's vintage. The Chairman's Trophy was given to the highest scoring entry per category. So this one won that award. We hope that you are delighted with the whiskey contained in these bottles. And distilling this product, we have attempted to make some of the finest American whiskey ever made. Sounds familiar, right? In tribute to the original Eagle Rare brand that was launched in 1975, this whiskey is once again bottled at the original strength of 101 proof. 100 proof is usually bottled in bond, which is, people consider that the perfect proof before it starts to burn too much. So this just butches it up a little bit more. So with this one, age, it was distilled in the spring of 2005, released in the fall of 2002. 2002. Spring, fall, same thing. It's going to have a little bit more age. The original brand release name was under Eagle Rare 17-year-old Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, proofed at 101 proof. It's always going to be that way because it's what it's always bottled at. So the recipe, large grain, is going to be Kentucky corn, distiller's grade number 1 and 2, because this is a straight bourbon whiskey. So there's less grain of rye in there or any other grains to make it that. The small grain, Minnesota rye. Finishing grain, North Dakota distillers malted barley. Same thing for this cooking and fermentation. Mash is still sour. So the aging and distillation was double distilled, beer still, and doubler. We're starting to catch a pattern, right? So with this one, proof off the still is 140 proof. This one comes off a bit hotter. Whenever they do the barrel, same thing. White oak, number 4 char, which is charred for 55 seconds. The entry barrel proof is going to be 125. So whenever it enters that barrel size, 53 liquid gallons, 66.25 of the original proof gallons. Warehouses are warehouse H, K, and L, floors 1 and 4. Evaporation loss, 70% of the original whiskey was lost to evaporation. So only 30% of this one made it in. Now with this one, bottling filtration is chilled, which means they use chilled water to bring that proof down. Coming out at 125, it ends up at 101. This one's product age 17 years and 5 months. 6 months, 5 months, see, it just depends. Depends on whenever they do it. So tasting comments on this, the nose, hint of tobacco and chocolate-covered cherries with a touch of oak. Palate, caramel, vanilla bean, dark chocolate, oak. The finish is going to be full-bodied finish with baking spice, vanilla, and butterscotch. Doesn't that sound delightful? So, who created Eagle Rare? This is where we started getting into more history with things. Eagle Rare was created by the master distiller Charles L. Beam in 1975. Beam, the grandnephew of Jim Beam and fourth master distiller of Four Roses, developed Eagle Rare as a luxury 10-year-old bourbon brand under the Seagram brand. This creation came at a time when the bourbon industry was struggling due to its decline in sales and a shift in the consumer preference towards clear spirits. Spirits go in a trend. Sometimes it's vodka, sometimes it's tequila, sometimes it's whiskey, gin. Things will go through trends. So that's why. But that's who created this one. Isn't it funny how distillers all have history with each other? One thing about Buffalo Trace that I do applaud them with is they say to honor tradition but embrace change. So that's their motto. So the next one we're going to talk about in the middle of the collection, William LaRue Weller. This one is the bottle that people are going to be most excited about in this collection. This is the more hard to get bottle because of pricing and allocation. What allocation means for spirits is how easy they are to get because of sourcing. For an example, King of Kentucky, which is from Old Forester, only half of their whiskey that they sell gets put out of Kentucky and into other states. There's only 10 states. So if they only do 2,800 bottles, there's only like 1,400 bottles available between 10 states. So 140 bottles a piece, I think, is what that equals out to, if my math's correct, while drinking. But that means that it's harder to get. So with William LaRue Weller, for this 2024 fall edition, and it won't say these on these last 3 bottles because it's just going to say the proof. But if you know the proof and you're able to find the batch, we can tell which batch it is. So with this one, it was Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. With this one, William LaRue Weller, or uncut and unfiltered Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. It was an honor to receive Best of Class North America for last year's vintage in the 2024 Global Whiskey Challenge. We hope that you're delighted the wheated bourbon contained in these bottles. In distilling and aging this product, we have attempted to create some of the finest whiskey at our distillery ever produced. Our William LaRue Weller was first launched in response to a consumer request for more well-aged and barrel-strength whiskey. We filled these particular barrels at 114 proof in the years 2010 and 2012, but after more than 12 years of aging, it's now 125.8. So, depending on the temperature and the environment that they're aged in, sometimes the proof can go up versus down. And that's where you want a higher proof. It usually involves more sugar and yeast for the alcohol to form in the original mash bill. But sometimes you don't need that to have a high proof at the start. It will end at a high proof depending on temperatures. So with this one, it was aged for the year of distillation, January 2010 and February 2020, 2012. Jesus. So that one, 2 year difference. So you get a different flavor of certain whiskeys released in the fall of 2024. Now, proof name or brand name William LaRue Weller Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, proofed at 125.8. Recipe for the large grain Kentucky corn, distiller's grade number 1 and 2. Small grain, soft red winter wheat. What wheat usually does in a whiskey is gives it more of a dry flavor, similar to how oak does. But whenever you add wheat gently in there, you give more of a balance to flavor. William LaRue Weller is accredited with being one of the first wheated whiskeys, if not the first. That's where Weller, the Pappy line, and also as well Blanton's, Elmer T. Lee, and all these other ones that start having wheat in there, and the mash bills all kind of comes from this guy right here. And if we recall, these are some of the more popular whiskeys available. So the finishing grain, distiller's malted barley. Sour mash, again, age in distilling. Distilled is double distilled, beer still, and doubler. Same thing. Proof off still is 130 proof. Same new white oak, number 4 charred for 55 seconds. It enters in at 114. Barrel size was 53 liquid gallons, 66.25 of the original proof gallons. The warehouse was the Rick warehouse, and the floor just says lower floors. They just picked ones that they liked that were on the lower floor, so that they probably had a little bit of a either cooler or warmer temperature, depending on how that Rick house environment was. Evaporation loss, 61% of the original whiskey was lost to evaporation. So a little bit less than we've been dealing with, 39% left. So this one has a little bit more. Now for the filtration, none. It's unfiltered. It's uncut. This is what the distillers get from the barrel after it is done. This is where it ends up at. So it's aged 12 years and 6 months. So William LaRue, 12 years. This is a younger one of the group, but not the youngest. With this one, tasting comments. Nose, delightful blend of new leather, pipe tobacco, and caramel enveloped with the warm sweetness of marshmallow and hints of ripe fruit. Palate, smooth and creamy texture with an immediate burst of rich caramel and toffee notes overlaid over a backbone of toasted oak. The finish, long and satisfying with the rich notes of oak, caramel, and fruit. With this one, like I said, this one, when everyone was tasting at the tasting, they all said that they like this. The 2 people I've sold this to so far, this is their favorite for the entire collection. It's usually allocated at a higher price. Now we're going to find out who was William LaRue Weller. So, in the namesake of William LaRue Weller Bourbon, a highly regarded wheated bourbon from the Buffalo Trace Distillery. The bourbon is part of the Buffalo Trace's antique collection, which is known for high proof and complex flavors. While specific history details about William LaRue Weller himself are limited due to his provided context, he is often referred to as the father of wheated bourbon. So, this title suggests that he played a significant role in the development and popularization of wheated bourbons, which was used wheat instead of using rye as a secondary grain in a mash bill. See, we had rye for the first one, rye as a secondary grain, and instead wheat for this one. There's differences in the entire collection. The collection is well thought out for what they chose for that regard. So we're going to talk about Thomas H. Handy. This is Sazerac. Now, this is the fall 2022. Thomas H. Handy Sazerac, our uncut, unfiltered straight rye whiskey. Our distilling team was delighted to hear that last year's release earned 97 points and was named named in the top 100 spirits by judges at the 2022 Ultimate Spirits Challenge. We hope you enjoy our unique whiskey contained in these bottles. Thomas H. Handy Sazerac Straight Rye Whiskey was first launched in response to the consumer request for a well-aged barrel-strength whiskey. This year's offering is comprised of barrels aged for over 6 years. We filled these barrels at 125 proof back in 2016, but after the years of aging, they are now at 130.9. So with this one, the year of distillation, spring of 2016, fall of 2022 is the release. Brand name was Thomas H. Handy Sazerac Straight Rye Whiskey. Proof for release is at 130.9. Now, recipe, large grain Minnesota rye. Small grain, Kentucky Distillers Grade number 1 and 2. Finishing grain, North Dakota Malted Barley. Now, same thing, sour mash, all that's the same. Uh, Distill and aging. For distillation, double distilled, beer still, and doubler. We're catching a trend, right? All of them are the same. Proof off still 135 proof, same new oak, new white oak, number 4 char, which is charred for 55 seconds. Enters the barrel, proofing at 125. Barrel size 53, liquid gallons 66.25, original proof gallons. The warehouses were I, L, and M. Floors 2, 4, 5, and 6. The evaporation loss was 31 of the original whiskey lost to evaporation. Because of these 6 years, this one ends up having a little bit less loss because the longer it's in a barrel, the more time it has to lose the evaporation. Bottling filtration, none. Uncut. Bottling age is 6 years and 4 months at the age of bottling. Younger. Now the tasting comments. The nose, floral, a nice marmalade, meringue, palate, baking spice with bursts of orange peel, subtle dark chocolate. And the finish is going to be long finish of cinnamon, praline, and candied orange. Remember how I talked earlier about rye grain giving it botanical notes? Allspice. You have the anise flavor. You got the marmalade. You got baking spice. These are all that name right in there. It does live up to that one. Now, who is Thomas H. Handy? Thomas H. Handy was a New Orleans bartender who played a significant role in the history of the Sazerac cocktail. He was born in 1839. And if I recall correctly, I thought it was the 1830s whenever he made the Sazerac cocktail popular for Antoine Peychaud. So, born in 1839, Handy worked at the Sazerac Coffee House from 1865 and purchased the business in 1869. He is credited with being the first to use rye whiskey in the Sazerac cocktail, replacing the traditional cognac due to that crisis in Europe that affected the cognac supply. So I'm assuming that had to affect the actual grapes because cognac is a wine that gets distilled afterwards. Handy's legacy is honored by the Buffalo Trace Distillery, which produces the Thomas H. Handy Sazerac Rye, a high-proof, uncut, unfiltered, straight rye whiskey, as part of their antique collection. This whiskey is named after him and celebrates his contribution to the American cocktail history. So that's Thomas Handy. We're going to talk about George T. Stagg. Now, this one is the heavy hitter in proof. This one is going to be proofing at 138.7. Now, for this one, this is the fall 2022 release. Now, George T. Stagg, our uncut, unfiltered Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. We were deeply honored when our last release of George T. Stagg was named World Whiskey of the Year in the Whiskey Bible. We hope that you're delighted with the whiskey contained in these bottles. Our George T. Stagg was first launched in response to the consumer request for well-aged barrel-proof strength whiskey. This year's offering is comprised of barrels aged more than 15 years and 5 months. After years of aging, this bourbon clocks in at 138.7 proof. So it was in the spring of 2007, were the years of distillation, to the fall of 2022. We already know the name of it, which is George T. Stagg Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. It's proofed at 138.7 proof. The large grain, Kentucky Corn Distillers Grade number 1 and 2. Small grain, Minnesota Rye, and the finishing grain is North Dakota Malted Barley. Same thing, sour mash. Same aging and distillation. Double distilled, beer still, and doubler. Proof off still 140 proof. The new white American white oak number 4 char, charred for 55 seconds. I've said this so many times, I'm getting tongue-tied at this. It enters the barrel at 125 proof. Same thing. 53 liquid gallons, which is 66.25 of the original proof gallons. Warehouse K, floors 1 and 3. Evaporation loss was 75%. This one is 24 or 25% of the whiskey left. With this one, no filtration, uncut, unfiltered. Aged for 15 years and 5 months of bottling. Tasting comments. You're going to get toasted pecan and chocolate sauce. Palate, rich blend of baking spice, vanilla, and cherry pie. The finish is robust, buttery finish of coffee, molasses, and oak. Now, who was George T. Stagg? George T. Stagg was a prominent figure in American whiskey or in the American whiskey industry during the late 19th and early 20th century. Here are some key points about him. Um, we don't need to know the parents' names, the military stuff. I mean, he was fought in it. Well, yeah. Um, for the whiskey industry, Stagg's path he crossed paths with Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr., a notable figure in the whiskey industry. This connection allowed Stagg to transition from a broker to a producer of whiskey. His legacy, Stagg is remembered for his contributions to the whiskey industry, particularly through the partnership of George T. Stagg bourbon with the George T. Stagg bourbon whiskey produced at the Sazerac Company in honor of his name. Now, with George T. Stagg, E.H. Taylor, and I believe it was OFC, which was Original Fine Copper, which is what became Buffalo Trace. So we end it with the distillery that became Buffalo Trace. This is why this whole rare allocated collection makes sense. There's history in a glass. You can sell these pours of whiskey because you know what you're selling your guest is more than just a pour in a bottle. This is a moment of history. This is a chapter in time. Whether they like it or not is subjective. These are fine whiskeys done in the finest of quality for the way that they're done. With all of these bottles here, Sazerac is usually allocated for around the price of, I want to say, about 1,500. Same with Eagle Rare. William LaRue Weller differs. It can be anywhere from about 1,500 to about 24, 2,500. Thomas H. Handy ranges from about maybe $500 to usually about 1,000. And then George T. Stagg is usually about 13-ish hundred whenever it's allocated. Obviously, if you get them at MSRP, which is the market sale for retail price, um, they're going to be a lot cheaper. But it is almost impossible to get most of these whiskeys at that price because you have to be in Kentucky about the time that they're actually distilling, bottling, and releasing in fall, um, which is very hard for a lot of people to do. Usually during that time, distillers will actually raise the tour prices and create an experience so that you can buy your own barrel for different things or, whatever they want to do during these times of year. So this has been my rundown course of our flights, how to taste them, how to provide a good experience to our guests. Obviously, whenever you get up to the last three, this is where, since they are unfiltered, uncut, you might want to recommend them diluting it. But we pour them in their full strength so the guests can dilute them. These will be served neat in the flight, half-ounce pour, with no water, no ice, nothing added to that. A good upsell for this moment would be to sell them on some Pellegrino sparkling water because that helps cleanse the palate. Now, I feel like any whiskey that we serve that's above about a 40 to 45 price range for the whiskey should be served in a Glencairn glass if served neat. I hope that you've enjoyed this course and gotten something out of it with how to taste, with the notes and the history for each one of these, and as well that you're able to pass on some knowledge to our guests to give them a better experience. I'm hoping that for this flight, we'll be able to have some notes for all of the different whiskeys for palate, nose, the actual name, and the proof or the year that it's released. So that way it makes it easier for us to not have to spout off every little note about them because they do have it in front of them. And it's also a good little keepsake for them as well. Taking away from that, I already have for our new bottle of that Eagle Rare because we're almost done with the 2022, the notes for 2023. This is a Google Drive. I've sent it to most of our group of staff. So if you don't have it, reach out to me or one of them and I will be able to get this for you. So I hope you've enjoyed this, learned something from it, and pass it on to a friend. Thanks for joining.